Hello friends, I'm DustFood, and in one of my most recent videos, I talked about the concept of whether or not the Alien chapter failed, and my ultimate thesis for that video was ultimately that it did not really fail, it's just more so that it was a case of poor timing, and even though it did lose about 10,000 players alone on Steam, I don't think it's a failure. I think it was a victim of circumstance, to be sure, but I also think there are two other things. I think there are two other things about it that I look at and I say, okay, maybe this contributed to subpar player count. Before I get into why I think maybe the results weren't quite what behavior was looking for, I do want to address kind of this elephant in the room that a lot of people brought up and somewhat refute it because I do disagree with the reasoning here. So one thing that a lot of people brought up is that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game came out the month that Alien was released, and obviously you're going to have some crossover there. They're both asymmetrical horror games. You're going to have some amount of crossover. And for some people, it is as simple as looking at it and saying, well, okay, DBD lost about 10,000 players over a 3-month period, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre had 10.5k players on Steam its first month of being played. So, okay, bada bing, bada boom, that's where the players win. But to me, that doesn't really explain it. That doesn't really answer the question, because in that instance, you're talking about 1 month of about 10.5 players, 10.5k, big difference there, on Steam. But then the month after, it was cut almost in half, and then the third month out, it was just dead. The game was already basically dead at that point on Steam, just because, you know, as a side note, I wanted to like it. I wanted to like the Texas Chainsaw game. Maybe I'll give it its own video, but it's so many flaws, so many issues, and ultimately, even as a guy who loved the Friday the 13th game, which was also done by Gun Media, I thought that Texas Chainsaw was just ultimately too clunky to be enjoyable. I'm not a big fan of the game, so I'm not really surprised that it died off as quickly as it did, even though, of course, like so many games, it does have its diehard fan base, so, you know, not trying to get on their bad side, but I don't think it quite accounts for the issues that Behavior was having with the Alien chapter, with that loss of players, because realistically, that could explain a 1-month dip. I don't think it explains a 3-month dip, so that would be one thing that a lot of people brought that up, and it's fair to point out. It is fair that when competition comes along, maybe the competition has an effect. But I think there are two much larger reasons, because last video I kind of just left it at saying, well, it was just poor timing, and then I moved on. But let's talk about the whole poor timing thing. Let's actually talk about why I think it was poor timing. And as I said, I break it down into two things that I think make it distinctly disadvantaged in this way. So the first one, as will, you know, be obvious kind of from the title, from the thumbnail, from all that, it's this concept of needle moving licenses. So you think about moving the needle, right? It's analogy mostly, I guess, for cards, because as you go faster and faster and faster, the needle moves from left to right. So that's kind of what we're talking about here, is what can move the needle for DBD. And for the longest time, we thought that there were a few slam dunk chapters that, oh yeah, this is gonna do it. This is a needle mover. Where it's a little surprising is that Alien was always absolutely one of those, because to give it its flowers, to give it its due, Alien is one of the greatest films of all time. Definitely one of the greatest sci-fi films of all time. It's fantastic. It's got a great monster. It's got a great protagonist. It's got interesting twists and turns. It's got really creative scenes of gore, especially. It's a fantastic film that should have been one that gets a lot of people interested, but it didn't necessarily do that. It really, again, I realize, as some people also point out, hey, it's always possible that they lost 10,000 players on Steam, but they gained 10,000 on PlayStation or Xbox or Switch. And that's true. That's true. That could have happened. We don't have those numbers, but it's absolutely possible that it could have happened. So I'm not denying that in the slightest, but I don't think there's much denying that from what we can see. From what we can tell, there was a drop-off. It wasn't quite what they were expecting. So it's made me look back on it and say, okay, maybe it's time to reevaluate what the needle-moving licenses are. And I think that for me, there's a pretty obvious issue when it comes to what would not necessarily work as well as maybe we had initially thought. So I want to give you a quick minute to answer a question here. So Dead by Daylight covers properties from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. Nothing from the 60s or before, and nothing as recent as the 2020s. So given that we're dealing with the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, which decade do you think has the most representation in DBD? If we're going off of the basis of this is when that license was started. Obviously, a lot of these had remakes and reboots and all that throughout the years, but in terms of the original property, which is usually what's being represented, which decade do you think is the most represented in the game as it currently stands? And by the way, not a trick question. This is not something where it's like, well, actually, no, very straightforward. I think you know the answer. The answer is the 80s. It's clearly the 80s. And I really don't think anybody's going to be surprised by that because the whole premise of Dead by Daylight is slasher films, and the 80s was really this heyday for slashers, even though the 70s are what kicked it off. So let me just break it down really quickly for you. From the 70s, we got Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was 74, Halloween, which was 78, and Alien, very recently, of course, which was 1979. So 3 properties from the 70s. The 80s are where it gets a little more interesting because I included Nicolas Cage here, but he was the hardest one to place. He was technically born in the 60s. He started acting in the 80s, and I don't think he really had his big roles until the 90s and the 2000s. But then, of course, he's still acting here in the 2020s with things like Renfield, which, by the way, fun movie. I would recommend it. I liked it. I almost did a movie reviewing it, but I almost did a video reviewing it, but I decided like, yeah, that's gonna get like 10 views. But yeah, it's a good movie. Anyway, so Nicolas Cage is tough to place, but I decided to just put him here because it's when he started acting, and he's famous for being an actor. So if you disagree with my criteria there, I understand, but that's my reasoning. Anyway, outside of Nicolas Cage, the 80s are represented with Evil Dead, which was from 81. And again, another caveat here, because I know technically it's Ash versus Evil Dead, but Evil Dead as a property came to be in the 80s. And the show was obviously just fan service for those who enjoyed the originals. Thankfully, the rest of them are a little less controversial in terms of where I'm placing them, because we have Nightmare on Elm Street, which was 1984. Yes, it's technically Remake Freddy, but come on, nobody's here for Remake Freddy. Hellraiser, which is 1987, and then Child's Play, which was 1988, even though, again, I realize, yes, it's technically not Hellraiser. Child's Play 1, it's Child's Play 2 more than anything, but come on, guys. We know, again, let's be intellectually honest here. With the 90s, we got Scream and Resident Evil, both coming from the far, far, far back times of 1996, back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth and one Das Food was born. So yeah, pretty ancient on that one. Ringu was 1998, and then Resident Evil 3 was 1999, even though it was rebooted in 2020, and that's the model they used for the actual DBD character of Nemesis. For the 2000s, we got Silent Hill 2, which came out in 2001. We got the original Saw film, which came out in 2004, and then we got Left 4 Dead, of course, where we got Bill, which came out in 2008. We hit a pretty steep drop off here though. This is where we start to kind of realize the issue, I guess, that I'm trying to point towards here is 2010s. We have one property, which is Stranger Things. And keep in mind, we even lost that one for a bit. And then 2020s, we have 0 properties, no representation for the 2020s. And I realize we're kind of young into the 2020s. I mean, we're just now getting to 2024. So there's a lot of time, right? Obviously, the latest Thanksgiving movie looks like a real banger. I think a lot of people like it. Who knows? Maybe that goes on to be a franchise. Megan was great. I really liked Megan. There is potential for these things to manifest into the type of thing that would be added to DBD later. But for the time being, nothing from the 2020s, one thing from the 2010s. And it's through this license of looking at different eras, different decades, that I start to see what I think are the false needle movers. So things like Predator, The Thing, Candyman, you can love these properties. And by the way, if you're like me, you do. Predator, I think, is debatably the greatest action film of all time. It's at least in the conversation. The Thing is debatably the best horror film of all time. It's in the conversation. Candyman, I wouldn't necessarily rank it the same as the other two, but I do think the original is a fantastic film. I really, really like it. Tony Todd just kills it in the role, haha, pun intended. You know, it's a fantastic film. I don't think the franchise as a whole is very good, but I do love the original Candyman. But if you're like me and you spend too much time on DBD Twitter, which is a toxic, evil place, you will notice that every time they start teasing chapters, for everybody that says, oh man, I think it's Predator, I think it's Candyman, or any of that, you have an equal, if not disproportionate number of people that say, no, I don't want that. No, please, not Predator. No, not Candyman. I don't care about these properties. And I think the issue we're seeing here is that a younger demographic just doesn't necessarily care about the things that millennials and older people care about. You know, millennials, Gen X, boomers, all that. they care about these properties, but do the Zoomers, do Gen Alpha, do they care about these properties? And Gen Alpha, I'm going to say, period. No, they do not. but do Zoomers? And that's what's kind of interesting to see. Do Zoomers care about the latest ones? Because everybody likes to talk about Zoomers like they're just these little kids that are, licking their iPads and sniffing glue. But your oldest Zoomers are in their 20s. Your average Zoomer is somewhere from like mid-teens to early 20s. We're at the point where they are important customers. And I think that that's one reason when you talk about a needle mover, it has to be something that appeals to the Zoomers. And unlike some, I don't say that with any kind of condescension. I'm not talking about Zoomers as if they're these beasts that we just can't understand. I'm talking about it as, hey, this is a lucrative market, and if you look at it, the people who are into 70s and 80s and 90s horror, we've tapped that market. We've hit that market pretty thoroughly. And I'm not saying to not hit it again, but I am saying maybe that Jason chapter, that Friday the 13th chapter, isn't going to be as lucrative as we might have imagined in the past, because realistically, is there anybody who's sitting around and saying, I love Jason Voorhees, I love Friday the 13th, I love slashers, and I love video games, but what I'm not going to do is play Dead by Daylight until they add Friday the 13th? Because realistically, I don't think so. I think that this hypothetical customer is either already playing the game or is just never going to play the game. I think that anybody who loves all the old slashers and all that, which again, I do too, I'm not judging, but anybody who loves all these old slashers is already playing the game if they're interested in the game. And I don't think that somebody like Jason Voorhees is going to change that. I don't think Predator is going to change that. I don't think Candyman or The Thing is going to change that. The only way to make these older licenses into huge needle movers, to me at least, is to give them some kind of fascinating power. It's why what I would consider to be one of the lesser known characters, not unknown by the way, but lesser known to the general audience, in Albert Wesker, is one of the most played licensed characters because his power is awesome. He's fun to play. The same thing looks like is happening for Chucky. Is Chucky as culturally relevant as the Xenomorph? I would argue absolutely not. Absolutely not. Some people may disagree with that. I don't think it's a competition. But Chucky looks really fun to play, and I think Chucky's going to have a lot more mains than the Xenomorph, which was a fine killer. It was fine. Was it great? No. But it was fine, I guess. But Chucky looks better than fine. Chucky looks very fun. So when I look around, I try to say, okay, what is a needle moving property? I think there's an obvious answer. I want to give a quick kind of runner-up here. It, I think, would be a runner-up in that, okay, it does have that mass appeal of the older generations saw the miniseries, maybe they've read the book, and then the younger generation, the Zoomers, grew up with it being kind of considered peak horror, which, say what you will, I did not enjoy the films. I thought especially part 2 was just dreadful, but it's not about how I feel about it. It's about what's popular. If it's about what I felt was popular, we wouldn't have a different Marvel movie in the theaters every other month. We would have, something else, something more up my alley, but it's not about me. It's about what the general public says. And the general public said they loved it. It was huge, is huge. I have little cousins, very young. I mean, we're talking like middle school age. They don't watch horror films, but they love Pennywise because they think he's cool. So generally speaking, yes, I do think that it would be one that would do all right, and it'd be a cool way to finally get a Stephen King property in there. So it could possibly be a bit of a needle mover, but obviously, let's not beat around the bush. The big needle mover, the one that would get a lot of people to come to the game that have not already accessed the game, would be Five Nights at Freddy's. And look, this is another one where it's like, it doesn't matter, right? This is The Rock. It doesn't matter what you think. You may think FNAF is lame. You may not like Scott Cawthon. You may have thought that the new movie was cheeks. You may have all these things. You may have all these negative things, but it doesn't change the fact that this is I would say almost inarguably the largest horror IP to come out since the 2010s. FNAF released in 2014. It was pretty much an instant hit on the internet. Obviously, it has a huge presence on YouTube. It did, and it still does. Thanks in large part to people like Markiplier and MatPat, PewDiePie, all that. And now it's got this movie that was a huge hit. This movie is doing buku bucks at the box office. And by the way, quick little review here. I didn't love it. I liked that it respected the source material. I liked that it was made for the fans, and I appreciate that. But as an actual movie, I thought it was pretty mid. But the animatronics look great. Hey, practical effects are always a win. But outside of that, yeah, not a great movie, but it's selling like a great movie. So to me, this is one that is just an absolute slam dunk. I think FNAF is the only one that I look at and I say, without a doubt, you would see the players. It would be a massive spike. So I think that's part of it. I think a huge part of why we don't really have needle movers is because, ultimately speaking, they're just tapping the same well too many times. And if what they want is this idea of being a museum for horror, of being Smash Bros for horror, they should absolutely keep tapping that well. They should get Predator, they should get The Thing, they should get Candyman, they should get Jason Voorhees, they should do all of these things. But if they do that, they should not expect new customers, at least not in overwhelming numbers. So that's one thing, and I mentioned that I thought it was a kind of a two-pronged approach. And the second thing that I think is much bigger, by the way, I think this is a much bigger reason why we haven't seen a true needle mover in a while. And take a shot every time I say needle mover this video, but the other thing is the lack of variety. And you may say, isn't that what you were kind of already talking about? And yes, to some extent, but I mean gameplay-wise. So ultimately, no matter who you bring to Dead by Daylight, they are going to fit a very narrow view of what a character can do. And an example of this would be the Nemesis. Nemesis jumps from building to building, it fires missile launchers, it is nigh unkillable. It is the ultimate weapon designed to kill the agents of stars. And by the way, it also can't break pallets. You know, it's also got to take its time to really work up the nerve to break a pallet. Michael Myers is the ultimate embodiment of evil. He is evil incarnate. You really can't kill him. He's just going to keep coming for you. He's going to attack you, and he's going to get you. And also, he takes longer to vault the window than you do. So, you know, so I guess you're faster than Mike. You get all these things. I mean, you can do this with any of them, you know, Alien, the Cenobite. You can do this with basically, you know, Pyramid Head's a great example, or Sadako would be a great example of people who you have to fit them into this very narrow view of what a Dead by Daylight killer or survivor can be. And if it's a survivor, by the way, talking about Ash Williams, talking about Bill Overbeck, talking about any of that, Nicolas Cage, all that, you're really limiting them because they're just a skin. Because there is nothing that, let's say, if you added Dutch Schaefer from Predator, there is nothing Dutch can do that Dwight Fairfield can't do, right? Maybe there's something that Dutch can do from a perk that Dwight can't do, but then Dwight can just the Dwight player can just prestige Dutch, and then all of a sudden Dwight can do what Dutch can do. However little logic it actually, you know, applies to the game. So it is this issue of everybody has to fit a very narrow mold, and ultimately I don't think we're going to see this huge massive spike unless they add something that mixes up the gameplay in a meaningful way. And they've tried that with some of the more recent events, and obviously the city on a hill, this light around the bend that we see right now, is the 2 versus 8 mode that they've added to DBD Mobile. And if you expect me to go on a whole rant about how the gacha game got the cool feature before we did, I'm not going to, because I actually think it's all right to use DBD Mobile as a testing ground to make sure things work before moving them to the actually impactful and meaningful game. But I do think that this is very promising. It's clearly something they've been working on. It's clearly something they would like to add to the main game at some point, and that's what would get butts in seats. I don't care what kind of property you bring it in with. If you were to pair 2 versus 8 with something that maybe people don't care about as much, like the Hatchet series with Victor Crowley, yeah, fine, do it. You're going to see a huge jump in numbers, and people are going to be like, wow, I guess a lot of people like Hatchet. But no, it's not that. It's that people are just craving some kind of new game mode. If you had, you know, again, you release it with somebody, maybe not a huge property. I don't know. I'm going to offend anybody when I start talking about non-huge properties. But let's say they did something kind of lame. I mean, I liked the movies, but let's say Happy Death Day was added, the baby killer. If you did that, but you also brought in a casual mode, yeah, you would see a lot of people return to the game. So I think that's the thing. Ultimately, behavior's big issue is variety, or more so a lack thereof. And if they want to bring players back to the game in droves, it's not going to happen for most licenses. Again, I think FNAF is kind of this golden cow that right now, or this golden goose, I should say, that is going to possibly see a jump like that. But for the most part, yeah, I think it's just, there is a desperate need for variety. So they need to appeal to a younger demographic, and they also need to add gameplay variety in a major kind of way. But ultimately, those are my thoughts, and I am interested to hear what you have to say. So do you think I'm off base here? Do you think that actually there are plenty of licenses they could add and they could get these huge type of spikes as they go on? Or conversely, do you think that maybe DBD is kind of a niche property and they've already tapped it out? There's really nowhere else to go, because I am interested to hear all that. But anyway, that is going to do it for me. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do all the YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, you know, whatever. I will see you in the next one. I hope to see you in the next one. I hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are. And until the next video, I have been Das Food. Bye, friends.
I've been dreaming on in my head like I've seen it. A life worth living is a life with meaning. I'll do what I love till my heart stops beating. I'm feeding this demon. got a taste, can't erase bitterness in my